What's up, everyone? Welcome back to KD&D, the show where we talk all things Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games. And today I want to give you an update on my Dungeon23 Mega Dungeon. I'm recording this in mid-February, and so far I've been keeping up pretty decently. I have 5 tips for you today. If you haven't taken on the Dungeon23 challenge and you're interested in it, or if you've been struggling and you're still falling behind a little bit, I'm going to tell you the 5 things I've done to keep this little book full and keep this brain cooking. So let's get right into it. The first thing I would recommend is when you format your journal that you leave a little space in the margins for notes. All of my pages that have dungeon drawings on them leave a little bit of space on the bottom for overflow, and then every 3 or 4 pages I've left stuff completely blank to fill in notes about the previous few rooms. This was a spot where I took advantage to list off some of the factions that I've come up with that are going to populate the dungeon in the area around it. And another thing you can do is use your margins creatively. You can see here on my map in the corner, I got into the margin to know a cliff, and I use that to kind of mark other areas of notes. And then right here, all of these previous rooms that I'm describing are actually on the previous page. So I kind of wrote in the margin, go back a page for these spots. So tip number 1 is plan ahead for where you can put notes. The second thing I would recommend you do is while you are putting together your rooms, use the format of parentheses month/day. So you can see that I've done that here in a few spaces down here where you can see there's an owlbear somewhere previously, and the owlbear is around the room 1-2 and room 1-3. So if I'm going back in the book, I can go to January 1st, January 2nd, and I know that this is the space I was talking about. So using that date format is really useful. It's come especially in handy as I've gotten into the second level of my dungeon in February here, because I feel like I've done a pretty good job of making the dungeon loop back in upon itself and have different having different alternative entrances, and being able to keep track of that spatially in my head is tough for me. So lining these out with a date has been very helpful. The third tip I have, and this can be something you do either immediately before you start the dungeon or as you go through, is have something like this right here, where you outline everything that's to come in your dungeon. I have the first level in a general theme, the wilderness entrance. The second level is the fortress of the Gobnobolds, which is the goblin, gnoll, kobold monsters that I've been using. Third room I don't necessarily have yet. I know that they're probably going to be the cult that is creating the Gobnobolds, but when I first drew this out, I didn't know. Below that are spider caves going all the way down to, in the very basement level, I think I'm going to do like a buried alien ship. The reason this is really nice is because now I can really properly foreshadow on other levels. If I know that spiders are coming on layer 4, then on layers 1, 2, and 3, I can maybe trickle in some things that might show that there's spiders somewhere around, and so on and so forth. My fourth tip for you is pretty straightforward, but don't be afraid to go back to previous rooms and add on to things that you hadn't thought of before. On this particular page, I had kind of mapped out a few things, and I think, as you can see, I did A, B, C, and I have each one of those marked on here. And then on the next page, I wound up adding on. So I went back to C and added a little secret in C. I went back and added a whole new space with E. I wanted to make this space a little bit more full. There was a bunch of emptiness. So I was like, all right, well, let's make this swampy terrain. So it's okay to go back to previous days, even if you're a few pages, a few months from now. Maybe in October, I'll be completely burned out. I'm just going to be flipping through my book, trying to find areas where I can flesh things out and count that as my day's creation. So my fifth tip for you today is don't be afraid to bust out your dungeon a little early with your friends and play through a couple of the rooms and see how things go. As they go through your adventure, they may inspire you to think of new things, or you might improvise something in the moment that helps fuel your creativity for the next few days of the dungeon. I played a game where 2 of my friends played a Minotaur and a Hadozi, and they wound up jumping off of a cliff, which would put them down to where I expect level 3 or 4 to wind up being in the dungeon, and so I've left a note for myself that around level 3 or 4 there will be a Minotaur and a Hadozi surviving on spider meat, because as you know from my previous outline, that level 3-4 has spiders nearby. So these NPCs were my friends' player characters who wound up jumping off of a cliff because of a mishap in magic. I never would have come up with these two particular NPCs without my players' and friends' input. So it really can't emphasize enough. And if you're worried about like not having enough prepared to run the game, if your players are anything like mine, granted I have a couple of middle school groups, they're not going to get very far. I've got about 30 plus rooms of this dungeon fleshed out, and in the 4 sessions that I've run this game in, I think I've explored a total of like 6 of the rooms with players. So all right, if you stuck around this far, I actually have a 6th bonus tip for you, and it involves these little pieces of paper that I keep tucked away inside my Dungeon23. So what I've done here is I took all of the different rooms that you've seen me flipping through, and I put them onto one simple map that kind of puts it all together in space. Oh, I've got it upside down for you. But I am by no means an artist. But after designing all these different rooms, again, I needed to figure out where it all was spatially, so that when the players are exploring the world and they tell me which direction they're walking, I know what encounter or what room they're heading towards next. So it's okay if you have a small book like what I do to get a separate piece of paper and kind of connect it all together. I have one more gridded piece of paper in here that I'm going to use for later dungeon levels once I'm trying to connect all of it together. And then I think when I'm all said and done, I'm going to try to maybe lay the whole thing out proper, but that's a job for December probably. So those are my tips on Dungeon23. I can't recommend this challenge enough. I have had so much fun. It's been a challenge. I often, another secret bonus tip, don't stress if you miss a day or you miss a couple of days. Often what I do is I just sit down and I'll do 4 rooms at a time and make up for the few days that I missed. Last night I sat down to do 4 rooms and I wound up doing another 4. So now I'm ahead. So just sit down as the creativity inspires you and go for it, right? Talk with your friends, talk with the other players, run some games. You'll be inspired to keep adding to this room, and you'll get fun ideas from them and their characters. So if you enjoyed this video, I really hope you consider trying to add some of these tips to your world building and dungeon design. Drop a like on the video and comment. Let me know if you're doing Dungeon23 or if you'd ever even consider doing a challenge like this. Subscribe if you want to see more from me, and I will see you in 2 weeks.